segregated South, issued a series of fiery sermons denouncing the laziness, promiscuity, criminality, drunkenness, slovenliness, and ignorance of Negroes. He shouted from the pulpits about the difference between doing a real job and doing a Negro job. Instead of practicing the intelligent saving habits of white men, Negroes too often buy what they want and beg for what they need. He said that blacks were thinking about sex every time they walked down the street. They were too violent, they didn't bathe properly, and their music, which was invading homes all over America, plunges men's minds into degrading and immoral depths. The preacher's name was Martin Luther King, Jr., and the immoral black people he denounced did more to integrate America than did the civil rights movement. Black citizens and bad niggers. Since emancipation, many African Americans have struggled against the barriers to citizenship and the behaviors that set them apart from it. Members of the black middle class, as well as what has sometimes been called the respectable black working class, have understood what historians of the modern civil rights movement often have not, that the project of making black citizens required a radical reformation of African American culture. By 1954, the Supreme Court understood this as well. Traditionally, the court's decision in Brown v. Board of Education has been interpreted as a gift to African Americans, but, in fact, the court's principal justification for its decision was that educational integration would benefit employers and the state. The court made explicit that non-normative black behavior was at odds with the integration of African Americans into the body politic. In ruling segregation in education unconstitutional, the court explained that, by depriving blacks of full citizenship, the United States was also depriving itself of the opportunity to create a new class of disciplined and productive workers and soldiers. Writing for the unanimous justices, Earl Warren argued that the schools should be integrated in order to take advantage of this opportunity. Today, education is perhaps the most important function of state and local governments. Compulsory school attendance laws and the great expenditures for education both demonstrate our recognition of the importance of education to our democratic society. It is required in the performance of our most basic public responsibilities, even service in the armed forces. It is the very foundation of good citizenship. Today, it is the principal instrument in awakening the child to cultural values, in preparing him for later professional training, and in helping him to adjust normally to his environment. For Martin Luther King, Jr. and many of the leaders of the civil rights movement, the requirements of citizenship merged with Christian asceticism. In his sermons and writings, King called for African Americans to work hard, to shun immoral forms of sexuality, and to curb their materialism. They would no longer abdicate familial and social responsibilities and would undergo a process of self-purification to produce a calm and loving dignity benefiting good citizens. In advocating nonviolence, King asked African Americans to present our very bodies as living sacrifices to attain citizenship and respectability, and offered himself as a model of self-abnegation. After his house was bombed during the Montgomery bus boycott in 1956, King issued a statement to the press in which he sounded not only like the Apostle Paul, but also like a citizen soldier willing to die for his country. "The consequences for my personal life are not particularly important," King said. "It is the triumph of a cause that I am concerned about." In 1957, King cemented his position as national spokesman for civil rights with 3 interlocking projects: the founding of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the launching of a voting rights effort called the Campaign for Citizenship, and an evangelical crusade to rid black people of unchristian and un-American habits. The first 2 projects have been noted by historians as marking King's ascendancy to leadership of the civil rights movement. What is remarkable, however, is the almost complete silence among chroniclers of King's career on his moral reform crusade among African Americans. In the summer of 1957, King delivered a series of sermons under the title Problems of Personality Integration. The sermons were clearly intended to prepare African Americans for entry into mainstream American culture. King encouraged those who are giving their lives to a tragic life of pleasure and throwing away everything they have in riotous living to lose their ego in some great cause, some great purpose, some great ideal, some great loyalty. By doing so, King said, they would create in themselves what he called the integrated personality. In subsequent speeches, as well as in an advice column he began writing for Ebony in 1957, and in a book he published the following year, King endorsed Christian self-abnegation as a means to attain first-class citizenship. To become citizens, African Americans must seek to gain the respect of others by improving on our shortcomings. King called for blacks to stop drinking and gambling and to curtail their desire for luxuries. On the causes of black crime, he blamed not only poverty and structural racism, but also the lack of discipline and morality in the ghetto. The church must extend its evangelistic program into all of the poverty-stricken and slum areas of the big cities, thereby touching the individuals who are more susceptible to criminal traits. By bringing them into the church and keeping them in touch with the great moral insights of religion, they will develop more inner stability and become more responsible citizens. King wrote. King even attributed poverty in large measure to what he considered the profligacy and laziness of African Americans. On these issues he approvingly paraphrased Booker T. Washington. There is a great deal that the Negro can do to lift himself by his own bootstraps. Well has it been said by one that Negroes too often buy what they want and beg for what they need. Negroes must learn to practice systematic saving. King was particularly concerned that African Americans had rejected the white work ethic. Don't set out to do a good Negro job. If it falls your lot to be a street sweeper, sweep streets like Raphael painted pictures. Sweep streets like Michelangelo carved marble. Sweep streets like Beethoven composed music. Sweep streets like Shakespeare wrote poetry. Sweep streets so well that all the host of heaven and earth will have to pause and say, "Here lived a great street sweeper who swept his job well." King recognized that black sexuality posed a special threat to his assimilationist project. We must walk the street every day and let people know that as we walk the street, we aren't thinking about sex every time we turn around, he told one audience. In Ebony, he impugned readers to avoid rock and roll, which plunges men's minds into degrading and immoral depths. While white Southerners spoke of African Americans in these terms, they commonly referred to bad niggers. Too black. One of the great untold stories of the civil rights movement is the flourishing and subsequent destruction of black ministers in the post-war period who were anathema to aspiring black citizens. It would not be an exaggeration to say that two of these ministers in particular, James Francis Jones, who was known as Prophet Jones, and Charles Manuel Grace, who operated under the moniker Sweet Daddy Grace, were the most popular religious figures among the black working class in the 1940s and 1950s. Even more popular than the rising group of ministers who would lead the civil rights movement. Prophet Jones headed the two largest Pentecostal congregations in Detroit during this period. He also broadcast a live weekly sermon over Canadian station CKLW, whose 50,000-watt signal reached several Midwestern cities with sizable African-American populations, and in 1955 began hosting a Sunday night program on WXYZ-TV, making him the first African-American preacher in Detroit to host a weekly television program. The radio and television shows were, according to several sources, the most popular programs among the city's African-American population. With the help of sustained national mainstream media attention, including feature articles in Life, Time, Newsweek, and the Saturday Evening Post, by the mid-1950s, Jones's admirers made up a substantial portion of the African American population as a whole, and he was almost certainly the most popular minister among Detroit's black working class. A researcher at Wayne State University who studied one of Jones's congregations wrote, "The devotees of the cult appear to constitute largely that class of persons who are near the bottom of the social and economic ladder." In 1955, the Detroit area circulation for the Saturday Evening Post jumped 30% when the magazine ran an extensive and flattering profile of Jones. Jones reveled in materialist self-aggrandizement. He spoke not from a pulpit, but from a $5,000 throne. In public, he often wore a full-length white mink coat draped over European suits, and at home he liked to relax in satin slippers and a flowing robe decorated with sequins and an Elizabethan collar. He was doused with cologne and festooned with enormous jeweled rings, and drove a massive white Cadillac. But most impressive of all was his 54-room mansion called Dominion Residence, which included a perfume parlor, barber shop, ballroom, and shrine to his longtime companion, James Walton, who died in 1951. Jones had the mansion painted a different color each season of the year. Perhaps most astonishing, nearly all of his wealth came from gifts he received from his followers, whose devotion to Jones was never cooled by the press's constant exposure of his homosexuality. Like Prophet Jones, Sweet Daddy Grace was a fount of self-love and an idol of the black working class. Beginning in Charlotte, North Carolina, in the 1920s, then expanding into Washington, D.C., New York City, and finally New England, Grace built a Pentecostal empire up and down the East Coast that by the 1950s included at least 500,000 members in 300 congregations in nearly 70 cities. Declared by Ebony to be America's richest Negro minister, Grace made every effort to demonstrate the validity of the title. His shoulder-length hair splayed across the collar of his gold and purple cutaway coats, which often framed chartreuse vests and floral print ties. More striking still were his 5-inch-long fingernails, usually painted red, white, and blue. Grace, who immigrated from Cape Verde and worked as a dishwasher and migrant farm laborer before becoming a preacher, said the nails represented his rejection of work. It may be no coincidence that in the late 20th century, this style of extraordinarily long and elaborately decorated fingernails became common among black, working-class women, many of whom worked at keyboards and cash registers, but who refused to subordinate themselves to their jobs. Grace rode in a custom-built Cadillac limousine, and he bought some of the most prestigious real estate in Manhattan, including the El Dorado on Central Park West, which was then the tallest apartment building in the world. By the mid-1950s, his total net worth was estimated at $25 million. And again, like Prophet Jones's fortune, most of it came from donations by Grace's working-class devotees. In many of his churches, the members constructed enormous, ark-like containers covered with dollar bills, behind which sat Grace's throne. Grace's services were also sexually charged. They began with him slowly walking down the red-carpeted aisle as his followers pinned 10, 20, 50, and sometimes $100 bills onto his robe. While a rhythm and blues band played, the congregants danced ecstatically. Asked why he promoted such libidinous revelry, he replied, "Why should the devil have all the good times?" Grace gave himself the title, Boyfriend of the World, and his theme song featured the chorus, "Daddy, you feel so good." The civil rights movement ended the careers of Prophet Jones and Sweet Daddy Grace. In 1955, after years of neutral coverage of Jones, the Michigan Chronicle, Detroit's leading black newspaper, published a broadside attack against the preacher, calling him a circus-type headline seeker operating under the guise of religion. 3 months later, after NBC scheduled an appearance by Jones on the Today program, the Detroit Urban League and the Detroit Council of Churches organized a successful protest to keep the prophet off the air. The most strident attackers came from C.L. Franklin, father of Aretha Franklin, pastor of New Bethel Baptist Church, and the emerging leader of the Detroit Civil Rights Movement. Franklin had been friendly toward Jones for many years, but now he called the prophet degrading, not only to local religious circles, but more significantly, a setback of hundreds of years to the integration of all races who are this time seeking democratic as well as spiritual brotherhood. Soon after the attacks on Jones, he was arrested for allegedly attempting to perform fellatio on an undercover police officer who had been assigned to investigate rumors that Jones ran a numbers-running operation. The local black press cheered the arrest. The Michigan Chronicle called it a victory for an increasingly vociferous element in the community, who demanded that people like Jones, who exist by the skillful intermixing of religion, fear, faith in God, and outright fakery solely for personal aggrandizement, be driven from their lofty perches. The Detroit Tribune, which in previous years had praised Jones, now denounced him for giving the impression to whites that the black race was under the guidance of a sex deviant. On the national level, Ebony devoted 4 punishing pages to Jones's trial, calling it a day of reckoning. Yet despite his ostracism by the black leadership, Jones's followers remained as loyal as ever. They packed the courtroom every day of his trial, and when the jury declared him not guilty, hundreds of them raucously celebrated and shouted, "All is well!" Jones was subsequently shunned by the press and lost his visibility as a representative of the black working class. But his enduring popularity was confirmed by the crowd of more than 2,000 people who attended his funeral in 1970, where his bronze casket was draped with his famous white mink coat. Daddy Grace faced a similar fate. In 1957, Lavinia Royster, a retired Georgia schoolteacher, filed a lawsuit against Grace, claiming that he had been married to her in the 1920s, but deserted her shortly after the birth of their child. Though the court quickly rejected the claim, the black press delivered a guilty verdict. Jet's headline read, "The Past That Haunts Daddy Grace. Dismissed alimony trial reveals secret of first wife." The magazine called the preacher America's richest cultist, and speculated hopefully that the trial would shake the kingdom of Daddy Grace. Joining the attack, Martin Luther King pointed a damning finger at the profligacy and irresponsibility of preachers like Grace. He told his congregation in Montgomery, "Leaders are needed all over this South, in every community, all over this nation. Intelligent, courageous, dedicated leadership. Not leaders in love with money, but in love with justice. Not leaders in love with publicity, but in love with humanity." The greatest threat posed by Grace and his followers was to the cause of integration. They were, according to King, too black. "If we're going to get ready for integration, we can't spend all of our time trying to learn how to whoop and holler. And we've got to have ministers who can stand up and preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. Not a Negro gospel, not a gospel merely to get people to shout and kick over benches, but a gospel that will make people think and live right and face the challenges of the Christian religion." The subjects of Grace's kingdom were unfazed. His supporters filled the courtroom to overflowing, and 8 months after the trial, tens of thousands attended his annual parade through downtown Charlotte. Yet by the time Grace died in 1960, the kingdoms of Sweet Daddy Grace and Prophet Jones had been conquered by a new generation of leaders. The civil rights leaders faced other competitors for the loyalty of African Americans, most famously black nationalists. But while the nationalists rejected integrationism and nonviolence, they shared with the civil rights leaders a contempt for the decadence of Jones and Grace, as well as the ethic of sacrifice. Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam insisted on strict discipline, hard work, and the renunciation of drugs, tobacco, liquor, gluttony, laziness, emotional display, and promiscuity. They promised a new black nation, where we can reform ourselves, lift up our moral standards, and try to be godly, whereas the black man in his current condition was not fit for self. The new black man would relinquish his desires for the good life in service of the nation. According to Malcolm X, Islam taught black people to reform ourselves of the vices and evils of this society, drunkenness, dope addiction, how to work and provide a living for our family, take care of our children and our wives. With a similar mission, the Black Panther Party, founded in 1966, organized itself into a semi-military organization in which duty to the community took precedence over what they called decadent and bourgeois desires for wealth and pleasure. Black cultural nationalists such as Amiri Baraka, Ron Karenga, and Nikki Giovanni routinely denounced attachment to materialistic fetishes as the white boy's snake medicine, and as the product of a slave mentality. The Last Poets, an avant-garde musical group that grew out of the black arts movement, condemned niggers, whose alligator shoes, Cadillacs, and preoccupation with sex made them scared of revolution. Sleeping on the floor. Significantly among the most ardent ascetics in the black freedom movements were whites. Applications for the Mississippi Freedom Summer Project in 1964 reveal that many of the white college students were attracted to the poverty and suffering of black Southerners. In explaining his motivations for participating in Freedom Summer, one volunteer wrote, "This is not a struggle to be engaged in by the mere liberal, for the liberal can't be counted on to make the sacrifices required. I have rejected my birthrights and voluntarily identified with the suppressed classes." Another declared, "I am against much of what my family stands for. I realize that 4 families could live comfortably on what my father makes, that is, comfortably Mississippi Negro style." In one application, a graduate student wrote that he would end his career as an academic to join the movement. "I can simply no longer justify the pursuit of a Ph.D. When the folks in Mississippi have to struggle to comprehend the most elementary of materials on history and society and man's larger life, I feel ashamed to be greedily going after higher learning. And when I reflect on the terrors and deprivations in daily lives here, I cannot return to the relative comforts and security of student life." Some of the volunteers could not contain their rage at those who chose to live in material comfort. In response to advice from white leaders of the National Council of Churches that the volunteers should project a respectable middle-class image, one wrote, "We crap on the clean, antiseptic, decent middle-class image. It is that decency we want to change, to overcome. So crap on your middle class, on your decency, Mr. Churchman. Get out of your goddamned new rented car. Get out of your pressed proper clothes. Come join us who are sleeping on the floor. Come with us and walk, not ride, the dusty streets of Gulfport." The white volunteers devoted considerable energy to teaching black Mississippians the value of the ascetic life, thus suggesting that the people they actually encountered on the streets of Gulfport and elsewhere in the state did not share their calling. Many of the white volunteers helped establish freedom schools for poor black children and served as teachers. Stoughton Lind, a white radical who was then a professor at Spelman College, oversaw the freedom schools and developed their curriculum. A central purpose of the schools, as stated in the basic curriculum written by Lind, was to inculcate values in black children that were antithetical to white middle-class life. The lesson was intended to find out what the whites' so-called better life is really like, and what it costs them. Another was to help the students see clearly the conditions of the Negro in the North and see that migration to the North is not a basic solution. An entire unit of the Freedom School curriculum was devoted to explaining the differences between what were called material things, which were associated with whites, and soul things, which were associated with blacks. The purpose of this lesson was to develop insights about the inadequacies of pure materialism. Among the ideas to be developed with the students were that the possessions of men do not make them free, and that Negroes will not be freed by A. taking what the whites have, B. the movement directed at materialistic ends only. A list of questions designed to lead to these ideas included the following. Suppose you had $1 million. You could buy a boat, a big car, a house, clothes, food, and many good things. But could you buy a friend? Could you buy a spring morning? Could you buy health? And how could we be happy without friends, health, and spring? This is a freedom movement. Suppose the movement could get a good house and a job for all Negroes. Suppose Negroes had everything that the middle class of America has, everything the rest of the country has. Would it be enough? Why are there heart attacks and diseases and so much awful unhappiness in the middle class, which seems to be so free? Why the bomb? An exchange between a white Freedom Summer organizer and his black constituents indicates that they did not share the same aspirations. When black teenagers in Greenwood, Mississippi, demanded that violent tactics be used to gain access to a whites-only movie theater, Bob Zellner, the son of a white Methodist minister and a lead organizer of Freedom Summer, was brought in to change their minds. At a community forum, Zellner argued that rather than focus on the movie theater, the teenagers should focus on more important matters. We feel that our concentration has to be on voter registration now, he told them. Integrating all the movies in the South won't achieve anything basic. A 16-year-old girl then responded, "You say that we have to wait until we get the vote?" she said. "But you know by that time what happens? The younger people are going to be too old to enjoy the bowling alley and the swimming pool." When the white volunteers arrived in Mississippi, they and the people they sought to emulate were often headed in opposite directions. Too bad for integration. While it is undeniably true that the civil rights and black nationalist organizations inspired great numbers of African Americans with visions of black uplift, movement leaders did not succeed in creating a mass commitment to the responsibilities and sacrifices necessary for revolution or for citizenship. The aversion to communal obligation was far greater among the black working class than among whites. As W.E.B. Du Bois, Langston Hughes, James Baldwin, and more recent scholars such as Robin D.G. Kelly, David Roediger, Saidiya Hartman, and Roderick Ferguson have suggested, the relatively liberated character of black American culture might very well have been the result of the fact that, for most, if not all of their history, African Americans have been to some degree excluded from citizenship, and therefore far less likely to internalize its repression. It is certainly arguable that, having created a culture of freedom out of slavery, segregation, and compulsory labor, when citizenship appeared attainable in the post-war period, the black working class demonstrated an unwillingness to relinquish the pleasures of that culture in exchange for their rights. As scholars have moved away from studies of black leaders and toward an examination of African American working class culture, evidence of this resistance has mounted. Draft evasion as well as insubordination against commanding officers in the military remained far greater among African Americans than among whites from the 2 world wars through the Korean and Vietnam Wars. During World War I, the only black combat division in the American Expeditionary Force frequently ran away during battles, resulting in the removal of the entire division from the front. There is also substantial anecdotal evidence that during both World Wars, large numbers of black men feigned illness or insanity to evade the draft. We have seen that during World War II, black men were more likely than whites to evade the draft. Similarly, historian Gerald Gill has found that draft law delinquency during the Korean War was extraordinarily high in black urban neighborhoods. In the early months of the war, it was estimated that 30% of eligible men in Harlem were delinquent in registering. At the national level, approximately 20% of those arrested for violating the Selective Service Act from 1951 through 1953 were African Americans. Black resistance to patriotic obligation peaked during the Vietnam War, when African Americans made up fully one-half of the eligible men who failed to register for the draft. It is unlikely that this resistance to military service was motivated chiefly by pacifism. Indeed, evidence produced by several scholars has corroborated Timothy Tyson's claim that nonviolent integrationism, rather than combative and autonomous opposition to racism, is the anomaly in African American history, even during the Civil Rights era. This research has revealed mass uprisings against racist violence in Decatur, Mississippi, Monroe, North Carolina, and Columbia, Tennessee, as well as countless examples of individual acts of violent self-defense throughout the South. In Birmingham, years of fighting in the streets against the racist police gave power to King's famous ultimatum to the city's white leadership. In his Letter from Birmingham City Jail, King warned that many streets of the South would be flowing with floods of blood if black discontent were not channelized through the creative outlet of nonviolent direct action. In northern cities, violent responses to poverty and police brutality were, of course, commonplace, and in the major uprisings in Watts, 1965, Detroit, 1967, and Newark, 1967, they were coupled with militant demonstrations of material desires in the form of looting. Robin D.G. Kelley, Tara Hunter, and other historians have found a long tradition of resistance to labor discipline among black working men and women. According to Kelley, this most often involved evasive day-to-day strategies, from foot-dragging to sabotage, theft at the workplace, to absenteeism, cursing, and graffiti. Kelley criticizes scholars who, in attempting to counter racist stereotypes, are often too quick to invert them, remaking the black proletariat into the hardest-working, thriftiest, most efficient labor force around. Rather, he says, if we regard most work as alienating, especially work performed in a context of racist and sexist oppression, then we should expect black working people to minimize labor with as little economic loss as possible. African Americans escaped the obligations demanded of good citizens in other, often clandestine ways. Though many commentators have argued that the tax revolt of the 1970s was largely driven by resentful whites, African Americans were waging something of a tax revolt of their own, less visible and perhaps less consciously political than the white rebellion, but far broader. Studies of Internal Revenue Service records have shown that non-compliance to tax laws was significantly greater among African Americans in the 1960s and 1970s than among whites. Furthermore, these studies do not take into account the vast, untaxed underground economy, which economists have estimated produced between 8% and 14% of the total national income of the 1970s, and whose participants were disproportionately black. A study conducted by the Department of Labor in 1971 estimated that 1 of every 5 adult inhabitants of Harlem lived entirely on income derived from illegal enterprises. Perhaps most tellingly, the black popular culture that arose in the 1950s and 1960s, a phenomenon ignored by nearly all historians of the civil rights movement, showed a distinct lack of interest in King's project. Despite civil rights leaders' admonishments to African Americans to forego personal gratification for a higher purpose, the most popular black urban folk tales during the period continued the oral tradition of venerating bad niggers who rejected the jive-ass jobs assigned them, defeated white opponents in athletic, sexual, and mental contests, and accumulated luxuries surpassing those of Vanderbilt, Goldberg, and Henry Ford. some of the most popular party records of the 1960s and 1970s were recordings of Rudy Ray Moore's stand-up comedy acts, in which he often recited X-rated versions of classic bad nigger tales such as Dolomite, Shine, Pimpin' Sam, and The Signifying Monkey. Similarly, Red Fox and Richard Pryor gained mass audiences with routines that unabashedly endorsed the sensuality of black culture. These performers established a dominant genre in African American comedy that proudly asserted black culture's embrace of pleasure and freedom over the repressive morality of whiteness. Moreover, these expressions of the superiority of African American badness were not exclusively masculine. No black comedian of the post-war period was more popular than Moms Mabley, whose orations on sex and soul food brought hundreds of thousands of black patrons to theaters across the country. In film portrayals of African Americans, by the early 1970s, the sexless and self-sacrificing characters played by Sidney Poitier during the Civil Rights era had been replaced by hypersexual superheroes who had achieved spectacular wealth by means other than working for the man. The so-called blaxploitation genre was created not by Hollywood, but by the independent black producers, writers, and directors of two films, Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song, which was released in 1971, and Superfly, released in 1972. The hero of Sweet Sweetback is brought up in a brothel and becomes a pimp to pursue a life of fine clothes, fancy cars, and unlimited sex. After witnessing two white policemen savagely beating a young black man, Sweetback kills the cops and escapes across the Mexican border. Ebony called the film trivial and tasteless, but the black working class voted with its feet. When the film opened at the Grand Circus Theater in Detroit, it broke the record for opening night box office receipts. Sweet Sweetback, which was made for $150,000, went on to gross more than $15 million. It was then the most successful independent film ever released. Superfly was even more popular among black audiences, grossing more than $18 million, and it too was attacked by the civil rights leadership. The film portrayed a Harlem cocaine dealer who escapes the drug business and the ghetto by ripping off a white syndicate boss and overpowering corrupt cops. The hero rejects both his position of power and the work ethic, preferring a life of pleasure and freedom. In popular music, the lyrics of African American songs in the era of civil rights and black power represented nearly all the desires the movement's leaders struggled to repress. Materialist aspirations were heralded by such enormously popular songs as Money Honey, The Payback, and Barrett Strong's Money, That's What I Want. Another staple of rhythm and blues lyrics was the rejection of compulsory labor. Fats Domino, Sam Cooke, and Smokey Robinson sang of hating Blue Monday and having got a job, but also of loving the liberation brought by the weekend. And as if in response to King's plea for hard work and frugality in Rip It Up, Little Richard wailed, "Well, it's Saturday night and I just got paid. Fool about my money. Don't try to save. My heart says go. Go, have a good time, 'cause it's Saturday night and I feel fine." Of course, R&B was also well-stocked with paeans to sexual revelry, from the Clovers' Good Lovin' in the 1950s to James Brown's Sex Machine in the 1960s, and Marvin Gaye's Let's Get It On in the 1970s. Chuck Berry's songs perhaps best captured the black working-class evasion of citizenship. As in many earlier blues songs, movement was a common theme in Berry's lyrics. In songs such as Maybelline, No Particular Place to Go, The Promised Land, and You Can't Catch Me, Berry sang of riding in fast and luxurious cars toward the objects of his desire, from sex partners to silk suits to lavish meals. In these songs, Barry is always on the move, never committing himself to a place. In the Promised Land, he drives around, through, and away from Norfolk, Raleigh, Charlotte, Rock Hill, Atlanta, Birmingham, Mississippi, and New Orleans. In You Can't Catch Me, he's up north in New Jersey, but even there he refuses to stop. While cruising on the turnpike, he encounters a state patrol. His car sprouts wings and takes off into the sky and away from the law. "Bye-bye, New Jersey," he says. "I'd be come and gone." These sentiments were triumphed in the rise of disco, the most popular music of the 1970s. Having originated in black, gay, working-class nightclubs, by the middle of the decade, disco dominated the airwaves, the Billboard music charts, and the dance floors. More generally, it was also at the center of the most sexually open era in American history. Disco culture celebrated the body, rejected work, and represented the antithesis of family values. Perhaps most striking, as many observers of the phenomenon noted, disco clubs were the most racially integrated public spaces in the United States. In one of the great ironies in the history of American race relations, a queer and entirely renegade creation produced more integration through desire than the civil rights movement ever achieved through moralism and legislation. Not surprisingly, some of disco's hardest critics came from the heirs of Martin Luther King. Virtually quoting King's condemnation of rock and roll in the 1950s, Jesse Jackson attacked disco as sex rock and as garbage and pollution, which is corrupting the minds and morals of our youth. Jackson threatened a boycott against stores that sold disco records, and his Operation Push held a series of conferences on the evils of the music. Disco did fade from the scene, but it gave birth to a cultural form that proved even more vexing to the remnants of the civil rights leadership. Since its arrival in the late 1970s, hip-hop has moved ever farther from King's vision. Today, the two dominant genres in the music and its visual accompaniments are the violently anti-integrationist gangsta style and bling, a carnival of conspicuous consumption and sensual gratification. Significantly, the achievements and failures of the civil rights movement corresponded with the desires and antipathies expressed in contemporary African American culture. Despite the insistence by Ella Baker and other movement leaders that the objectives of the sit-in movement were, as Baker said, bigger than a hamburger and not limited to a drive for personal freedom, testimonies by sit-in participants indicate that many African Americans in the South welcomed the desegregation of public space as their entry into the consumer culture. After the lunch counter at the largest department store in Atlanta was desegregated, sit-in organizers were dismayed that the first black people to eat there honored the occasion by dressing in their finest clothes, including fur coats. Other, broader accomplishments did not fulfill King's vision of a new black citizenry. Though the Voting Rights Act of 1965 created new opportunities to participate in American governance, what many movement historians hail as a revolution that opened the door to full citizenship for African Americans, black voter turnout actually began a steady decline shortly after the passage of the law. Meanwhile, however, trade unions made inclusive and non-discriminatory by years of black rank-and-file struggle improved the material lives of hundreds of thousands of African Americans. This, coupled with the opportunities created by affirmative action policies, paved the way for a dramatic growth in the black middle class, which by some estimates more than tripled in size in the decade after the death of King.